Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another edition of Shane Flynn Outdoors. It's the 1st of March, and I'm really itching to get out and do some fishing. And the weather is starting to warm up a little bit. But it's that time of year when the weather warms up for 2 or 3 days and then cools down for 3 or 4 days, and that yo-yo effect of spring fighting winter, winter fighting spring, however you want to look at it. And it keeps the bass kind of in a odd pattern. But I have figured out a way. I've learned how to target the bass this time of year pretty effectively and really target big bass this time of year. And I do that by following the weather pattern. So I wanted to share with you some of the techniques that I have found, because February and March, late February, early March, or all of March into April, is usually when I catch most of my big bass. And I was just out just a few days ago, and we had a last warm up, and hooked a big bass. It got off, my fault. And so this is a true and tried pattern I've used over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's a pattern that I learned from my father years and years ago on when to get out and target big bass in the spring. And it takes a few things into account. One, it takes into account the weather, for sure. That's one of the prime things you have to think about, and focusing in on water temperature. Right now, the water temperature is probably in the low 40s here in Virginia. Depending on where you're at in the United States, it's probably warmer or cooler. But the low 40s is kind of not really active for bass. But we'll get these warm-up days. If you watch the weather, like we're starting that pattern here this weekend in Virginia, where the weather will move into the 60s and 70s into the day, only be in the mid to high 40s at night. And it raises the water temperature up over that time period about 8 or 9 degrees over a 3-day period. So the first key to this is fishing on that third day. The third day of a warm-up usually will be the best day to fish this weather pattern. The second key element to this is south or southwest winds. Usually on that third day, you'll get a little bit more wind, and it's usually from the south and the southwest. Now, you don't have to have that wind, but that is just the most effective wind direction that I've noticed for catching big bass in the spring, in the very early spring or late winter, however you want to categorize this time of year. So you have to have that, one of the key elements is that third warm-up day when the water temperature gets up 7 or 8, 9 degrees, the bass will want to get a little bit more active. And the second thing is that wind. And the third thing is where on the lake you fish matters. So banks that are on the north side of the lake or north part of the lake, which get more sunlight from the south, so maybe you can say it's a southern facing bank, but it's the north. Here's an example here on my whiteboard. So when you get the north bank on the lakes and you get southwest winds blowing into those that northern bank, this is where the water warms up the most because it catches most of the sunlight. So your bass will tend to want to move up on that side of the bank. Now, not every lake is the same, right? And you might not have much of a north bank depending on what lake you're on and the way it faces. But just primarily north, northeast, northwest, however you want to look at it, those banks usually will get the bass moving up closer to the shore with the wind. Usually the bait fish will move up because of the wind and the warmth, and the bass will go up onto the banks, especially into pockets. If you have little pockets, these aren't coves, these are just pockets on these banks, and these are the pockets that I target. And usually I will catch a big bass in those pockets on those banks. As shallow as a foot of water to 10 inches of water. I really focus on those banks with the wind blowing to them in those coves. And those aren't deep coves. They're just shallow bends, if you will. Not real like 100 yards long. This might be 20 yards, 10 yards deep. But it's just a place that the wind blows, the bait fish gather back up in there, and the bass go back and target those fish. And the bass become very susceptible to catch. Now, what I'll tell you is you may not catch a lot of bass with this technique, but you catch big bass with this technique. And when I say big bass, 3 to 6, 7 pounds. I've just looked through my phone, looked at some of my photos over the last 3 years. From 5 to 7 pounds, all were in March all using this technique. So it's a pretty tried and true technique or pattern, if you will, for fishing with that south-southwest wind in the northern banks. A couple other things to consider is if you have a rocky bank that's on the north side or gets a lot of sunlight, like on the riprap, brings bass too. The rocks absorb the heat faster. The bass want to move up towards that heated water because the bait fish want to move up towards that warmer water. So also take that into consideration. Able Lake, which is a lake close to my house, this is actually one of the banks on the north side, and there's a lot of rock in that area. And that absorbs the heat as well. But I'll tell you, on the lake, another lake close to my house called Hunting Run, it has a big riprap that's a northern riprap that gets a lot of sunlight. That is a big bass producing spot this time of year. That lake's closed. It opens this weekend, so I'll be hitting that bank. So that's the areas and the weather conditions that I focus on in early spring to catch big bass. Now, what do I catch these big bass on? 4 baits that I would tell you I use that is very effective. The first one is a shallow running square bill crankbait. This is like a bait, a 2 foot. I like them big. I like color. I throw them way up in that pocket, real shallow, and bring it and burn it through. Not real fast, but pretty quick. Very effective for catching big bass. So that's one bait that you can use. Second bait, especially if you got a little bit of brush or timber in the back of these coves, I like to fish a swim jig. The swim jig works real well. And maybe what I do sometimes, and if I don't get a bite on this guy, and I've caught fish in that cove before, I'll slow down a little bit and throw this swim jig in there, and usually I'll get a bite on that. And then the other 2 baits, you may have guessed that I've done real well with. One is the spinner bait, and the other is the chatterbait. Throwing those back in there, in those coves will get you a bite as well. They're looking, typically the bass, the reason I like to go with this bigger baits, the bigger flashier baits, is they're back there to eat. They're not just that back there hanging out. They're not looking for a place to spawn. They're there looking for a quick meal because those bait fish is gathered in these back coves because the water's warmed up. It's pretty effective. I've used it for several times in the past, and I have caught big bass after big bass after big bass. And hopefully I can show you a video. What I will do is I'll clip in now a quick video of where I went out just a few days ago. I didn't get but an hour or 2 to fish, but I missed one big bass, and you'll see this one bass and how I threw back in the back of the pocket and caught that one. There's the bass. But the back of those pockets were, I thought they would be. Water temperature is 48 degrees, 47, almost 48 degrees. I missed a monster. I hooked him, and I didn't get it on video because behind the boat, but they're in these shallow pockets at 47, 48 degrees. That's the second bite I had today. The other one was, if I'd have caught that one, I would still be talking about it for 30 minutes, but the weather has warmed up for a few days, and what I've done, I waited till the last day. There's a front moving through tonight. Just took a couple hours to get out here and see if I can catch some bass in the afternoon of that third warm day, because it's supposed to, the bottom's going to drop out and get back in the 30s and 40s. But I was out here a week and a half ago, and the temperature, the water temperature was 39 degrees. I caught one little small bass. The bass were suspended. It was hard to catch them. So what I thought I'd do is, I know this lake real well. But if I go back in these pockets where the wind has blown into the back of the pockets, that's where the bass would be. And the one pocket that I usually do catch a big bass in, I hooked a big bass in today. These are two good little pockets that I'm in here too. The wind's blowing into them. I have been seeing some suspended fish, so on the live scope, but I'm on a mission. I'm big bass hunting. So as you can see from that video, I was way up in those pockets catching the bass on the banks where the wind was blowing back in there. The water temperature got up to about 47, 48 degrees that day, and that's where I targeted the fish. And there were bait fish back there in the shallow water. One thing I'd add that I didn't add earlier in the video is if you have a bank that's northern facing and it's extremely like a real long shallow shelf of a foot, this might not be the place to fish, because you need to have access for deep water where those bass have been wintering, where they can move back up into those shallow areas. They're not going to move they're not going to make a real long trip, but you need to be focused around areas that have some water where bass have been wintering, some deeper water. I really do believe this technique works, and I hope that you incorporate it and hope it helps you catch a big bass this spring as well. I'd like just to take a moment to let everybody know that I appreciate everyone who's signed up for the Big Bass Challenge for the month of April. We've had about 15 entries. Will be answering all your emails very soon. I don't want to answer them too early. You will get your instructions on how to register your catch, and I promise it'll be very simple on how to register. So you'll be seeing an email back from me very soon. For those of you who are interested and have not registered, all you have to do is email me at shaneflintoutdoors@yahoo.com that you'd like to enter the contest, and I will send you an email in a few weeks on the instructions on how to register your catch. It'll be very simple. We're giving out over $500 in prizes for the first, second, and third largest bass. So for all of you, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, tight lines and good luck fishing.